This time it's 5 underrated classic British motorcycles. All too often when the topic of classic British motorcycles comes up, people tend to fixate on the same old machines, Gold Star, Bonneville, that kind of thing. While these are all very fine machines of course, in its time the British industry made a lot of really fine machines. So let's pour a bit of praise on the bikes that often are overlooked and overshadowed in the rush to look at these so-called more glamorous models. The AMC pre-unit singles. Like so many British singles, the G3 dates all the way back to the pre-war era, and in its military form the G3L was a very popular dispatch rider's tool. Of course the machine was available in both AGS and matchless forms, with the sporty G80 and G3 being the matchless forms and the Model 18 being the AGS, and of course there were 350 and 500cc capacities. The engine was at 498cc and had a bore and stroke of 82.5 by 93 in its earliest forms. This would later be changed to 86 by 85.5 following the practice of the more sporty CS models. In the early days, to differentiate between the AGS and the matchless, the mag dyno was carried in a different position, being carried behind the cylinders on a matchless and before the cylinders on an AGS. Later on this would be unified between the two machines. However, in 1957 there was a move towards a Lucas alternator and coil ignition, and at the same time the introduction of a much less leak-prone primary drive cover. The machine was famous for its use of hydraulic front forks, a first on a British bike of the era, although early post-war models do feature rigid rear ends, but AMC were early adopters of spring rear suspension, and their early single down tube swinging arm frame would last until 1960 when a twin down tube frame replaced it, and later still the engine would feature cast-in pushrod tubes. But herein lies the essential problem with these machines. Most British companies have moved on to unit construction singles by the mid-60s, but AMC continued to produce and evolve their pre-unit big thumpers to an ever decreasing market, and even though AMC themselves would develop a much lighter weight 350, their big thumpers would remain in the range right until the bitter end in 1966. Now of course, while this is not good news for AMC, it's very good news to the prospective buyer today. There are lots of these machines around, and they're available at fairly modest prices, but despite this they are very fine examples of the breed. So if you're on the market for a big single thumper, AMC's range could be just the ticket for you. The Ariel Arrow. Ariel was a company based in Selly Oak, Birmingham, and were founded by James Starley, the man who had patented the spoked wheel in Britain. And incidentally, his nephew, also named Starley, would paint in the safety bicycle. And so, not surprisingly, like so many bicycle manufacturers, they would move into motorcycles at the turn of the century. And there's no doubt that during the lifetime, Ariel were renowned for being great innovators of the art, from their sporting red hunters to, of course, the square four, but perhaps none more so than the Ariel leader and arrow machines. And these bikes were the final works of one Valentine Page, a man who had cut his teeth designing bikes and engineering at Brooklands during the 1920s. But the leader was something very different. Here was a fully enclosed machine with a two-stroke parallel to an engine of 247cc with a bore and stroke of 54 by 54, which made use of a pressed steel frame which afforded the bike excellent handling. With its all-round weather protection, the leader was seen very much as a touring motorcycle and could be available specced out with built-in panniers and indicators to boot. But while its 17 horsepower was respectable for a 250 of the period, it wasn't exactly sporty, and while the machine was not quite the success hoped for, neither was it a failure that many other people will tell you, with Ariel selling over 25,000 of the leaders alone. But the company did find themselves with a little spare capacity, so Bernard Knight was tasked with the job of producing a slightly more conventional looking machine. So he set to work removing much of the leader's bodywork and saving around 20 kilos in the process to produce the Ariel Arrow, a machine that was faster simply by virtue of its lighter weight, because it still used a 17 horsepower standard motor at that point. But Ariel quickly realised there was potential for a slightly higher performing machine. And so to that end in 1961, Ariel announced the Arrow Sport, often called the Golden Arrow because of its paint scheme. And the engine on the new machine was slightly tuned over the previous model, with a raised compression ratio to 10:1 and a larger carburettor. And the result of this tuning was around 20 horsepower at 6,500 RPM, which gave the machine a top speed, as tested, of 81 miles an hour. Unfortunately, the time of the bike's introduction could not have been worse, because sales of motorcycles in the UK went into sharp decline after 1960, and the American importers were not keen at all on a pressed steel frame bike, and asked if a tubular steel framed version could be produced. And another major blow was that Burman, who manufactured the bike's gearbox, were getting out of the bike transmission business. Ariel's parent company BSA did consider recasting the engine cases to accommodate a BSA gearbox, but in the end they decided to focus attention on their own 4-stroke singles. But in retrospect, considering the development potential of the parallel twin 2-stroke, you have to wonder if this was a wise decision. Because today the Ariel represents a machine with good performance for a 250 and with excellent handling, which feels extremely modern. The Royal Enfield Meteor Minor. Royal Enfield's first parallel twin, the imaginatively named 500 Twin, arrived in 1949, with the bike first being shown to the public in November 1948. Designed by Ted Pardo and Tony Wilson-Jones, the bike had a lot of similarities with the Bullet range, which was introduced about the same time. The engine featured the familiar Royal Enfield cast-in oil tank, and at the top end the rocker box was cast in too, and the chassis was essentially the same as the Bullet with light modifications, and was therefore of course an early swinging arm frame. And the 4-speed gearbox featured that neat neutral finder. This might seem a little bit superfluous, but believe me, when you're riding one of these bikes on a hot day in heavy traffic, it's a very useful thing indeed. The engine shared its pistons and conrods with the 248cc Model S single, so on a bore and stroke of 64 by 77, making for 496 cc's and 25 horsepower at 5,500 RPM. With its aluminium head, the engine was a fairly neat design, although a better bottom end would have been desirable. Unfortunately, the styling was seen as a bit old hat, and the performance was fairly modest. However, in 1958, the 500 Twin was replaced by the Meteor Minor. Now, although the two machines look vaguely similar, and you could argue that the Meteor Minor still has fairly staid styling, the design is considerably updated, with a beefed up bottom end. And while the top end retained its separate aluminium heads, the new engine featured over square dimensions of 70 by 64.5. So while the capacity remained at 496 cc's, the nature of the engine had changed quite a bit. It was much more rev happy than the previous model. And compression was much higher too. Royal Enfield would claim 34 horsepower and a top speed of just over 90. But unfortunately this styling was never quite on point. They didn't make a Continental GT500 after all. And being a relatively small company made their products a little bit more expensive than the BSAs and Triumphs of this world. Which is a pity, because the Meteor Minor is a capable machine and a match for many of its peers. The AMC Twins. Designed by Phil Walker, the first of AMC's parallel twins was first demonstrated at the Earls Court Show in 1948, with the 498cc G9 being the matchless version, although in truth the only difference between the two ranges was the badges and the colour schemes. Walker's design bristled with individuality. The company was an early uptaker of swinging arm rear suspension, and the engine design was individualistic too. It shared a 4.5 camshaft with Triumph's engines, but it also used separate barrels and heads, and valve adjustment was cleverly achieved by the use of a cam at the top end, which was cast in of course to the cylinder head, a design later copied by BSA on their singles. But of course the most famously distinctive feature of the engine was its unique use of a central bearing, at least unique for a British parallel twin that is. This was done in the hope it would provide a tougher bottom end and less vibration. In the end, however, it achieved neither, AMC however had great faith in the engine and believed it could form the basis of an over-the-counter racer. And to that end they designed the truly beautiful G45, a machine which Robin Sherry rode to a creditable 4th place in the Manx Grand Prix in 1951, although the vibration did nearly shake his fillings out. In later seasons the engine would be smoothed out considerably. But back on the road, the US market demanded more cubes, and to that end in 1956 they introduced the 592cc G11. In its now revised form, the engine ran almost square dimensions of 72 by 72.8, and while the base touring model made 34 horsepower, the CSR, it doesn't mean coffee shop racer incidentally, 40 version made 39.5 for a top speed of around 102 miles an hour. But it wouldn't be until 1959, some years after their competitors, that the company finally had a 650 twin, and this would be the G12 in matchless form. And like its smaller siblings, the bike would be available in various forms, from the 100 mile an hour Tour to the 110 miles an hour CSR. But the bike had a frumpy image, and even endurance racing success didn't improve this. And indeed the old man frumpy image persists today, which is good news for the prospective buyer of course. The BSA A7. BSA's A7 was introduced in 1946 and in its original form featured a 495cc engine with a bore and stroke of 62 by 82, but given the low quality pool petrol of the period, ran a fairly low compression ratio, so made just 26 horsepower for a top speed of around 85 miles an hour, and there was a 4-speed gearbox which bolted directly to the back of the engine, and the chassis had telescopic forks but a rigid rear end, although plungers would arrive as an option later. In 1949, Bert Hopwood introduced the 650 A10, and while this was based to some extent on the earlier A7, it featured a number of improvements which would be applied to the A7, which would result in a totally revised engine of 497cc with a bore and stroke of 66 by 72.6. The revised engine would now be capable of 30 horsepower at 5,800 rpm and a top speed of around 90 miles an hour. Although the gearbox, for now at least, would remain bolted to the back of the engine. But this would change in 1954 at the introduction of the swinging arm frame, a change which would allow BSA to use a broader range of gearboxes across the parallel twin range. From then on the bike was available in 2 forms, the stock A7 or the Shooting Star SS model with its aluminium head. Either however make excellent road machines. Top speed is just over 90 miles an hour and the understress motor is very reliable and produces very little vibration. And while not as glamorous as some of its competitors, it is a great handling and very smooth riding motorcycle, with surprisingly good performance given its modest power claims. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us cover in a future video? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.